How did the Wannsee Conference affect the establishment of concentration camps? On January 20th, 1942, in the Berlin suburb of Wannsee, Nazi officials met there to discuss the final solution. Between 1933 and 1945, Nazi Germany and its allies established more than 44,000 camps and other incarceration sites, including ghettos. The perpetrators used these sites for a range of purposes, including forced labor, detention of people who thought to be enemies of the state, and for mass murder. In March 1933, the first concentration camp, Dachau, opened outside of Munich, Germany. The camp was used primarily for political prisoners and was the longest-running camp operation, and it was liberated in April 1945. Nazi officials established 44,000 incarceration sites during the time of the Third Reich. Not all facilities were concentration camps. Most prisoners in Early were political prisoners, which included German communists, socialists, and social democrats. Concentration refers to a camp in which people are detained or confined under harsh conditions and without legal norms of arrest and imprisonment that are acceptable in a constitutional democracy. What were the types of camps? Concentration camps, used for the detention of civilians who were seen as real or perceived enemies of the Reich. Forced labor camps. In these camps, the Nazi regime brutally exploited the labor of prisoners for economic gain to meet labor shortages. Prisoners lacked proper nourishment, rest, equipment, and clothing. Transit camps. These camps were temporary holdings for Jews awaiting deportation. These were the last stops before deportation to a killing center. Prisoners of war camps. These were for Allied prisoners, which included Poles and Soviet soldiers. Killing centers. These were established primarily for the assembly line-style murder of large numbers of people who arrived at this site. There were 5 killing centers that were for the murders primarily of Jews. The concentration camps served 3 purposes. 1. It was used to incarcerate real and perceived enemies of the state, and these people were incarcerated for an indefinite period. 2. It was used to eliminate individual and small targeted groups of individuals by murder away from the public and judicial review. 3. It was used to exploit forced labor of a prisoner population, and this grew out of a labor shortage.
In many of the concentration camps, the Nazis installed or was planning to install gas chambers that used carbon monoxide gas to kill prisoners who were too weak or sick to work. The camps were all built in the same way and had an internal camp staff that consisted of 5 different sections in it. It had the commandant's headquarters, a protected detention ran by security police officers, commander of the protective detention camp, administration and supply, and the SS physician. Forced labor camps were opened after the German invasion of Poland in September 1939, and it killed thousands of prisoners through exhaustion and starvation. During World War II, some Nazi doctors performed medical experiments on prisoners. The Nazi increased the number of prisoner of war camps and subcamps after the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. The final solution was the genocide or mass destruction of Jews. This caused the Nazis to establish killing centers in German-occupied Poland, the country with the largest Jew population. The first killing center was in December 1941 at Chelmno. The Holocaust era began in January 1933 when Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party came into power in Germany. The Holocaust was a state-sponsored persecution and mass murder of millions of European Jews, Romani people, the intellectually disabled, political dissidents, and homosexuals by the German Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. Hitler blamed the Jews for the country's defeat in 1918. While Hitler was in prison, he wrote a book that was a memoir and propaganda tract called Mein Kampf, also called My Struggle. In this book, he predicted a general European war that would result in the extermination of the Jewish race in Germany. Hitler was obsessed with the idea of the pure German race that he called Aryan. Hitler took advantage of the weakness of his rivals to enhance his party's status. The first mass gassings began at the camp of Belzec on March 17, 1942. The largest camp was at Auschwitz. During the Holocaust, the German army expanded Hitler's empire as effort for the final solution by conquering Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. At the beginning of 1941, Jews from the continent and with hundreds of thousands of European Romani people were transported to Polish ghettos. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising from April 19 to May 16, 1943. During this, 7,000 Jews died and 50,000 survivors were sent to extermination camps.
By spring of 1945, German leadership was dissolving as Göring and Himmler sought to seek and distance themselves from Hitler to take power. On April 29th, Hitler blamed the war of the Jews and urged German leaders to follow the strict observance of the radical laws with merciless resistance as a last will before he committed suicide later on that same day. Germany's formal surrender in World War II came a week later on May 8, 1945. German forces started evacuating death camps in 1944, sending the inmates to march further from the advancing enemy's front lines. This was known as death marches, and it continued all the way to German surrender, which resulted from 250,000 to 375,000 deaths. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, most survivors felt there was no future for Jews in Europe. They desired a homeland where Jews would no longer be a vulnerable minority. Many Holocaust survivors made their way to parts of Europe liberated by the Western Allies. They hoped to find new places to call home and begin life anew. But fulfilling this aspiration was still difficult. Immigration restrictions remained in place. For the United States, British-controlled Mandatory Palestine and other destinations. Mandatory Palestine is a territory in the Middle East that was under British administration after World War I until Israel's establishment in 1948. It was established following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The League of Nations granted Britain a mandate over the area, which encompassed present-day Israel, the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and Jordan. In the Allied occupation zones in Western Europe, many Holocaust survivors were housed in refugee camps called displaced persons (DP camps). At its peak in 1947, the Jewish DP population reached approximately 250,000. These camps were never intended as permanent homes, and most of the DPs were desperate to leave. In the summer of 1945, the U.S. representative to the Intergovernmental Committee for Refugees, Earl G. Harrison, undertook a mission to determine the needs of Jewish and other non-repatriable DPs. In the resulting report, Harrison offered scathing criticism of the DP's treatment. He described crowded and unsanitary conditions in the DP camps, and he also offered recommendations for improving conditions for Jewish DPs.
Harrison urged quick action to resettle the Jewish refugee population. Most Jewish DPS, he noted, wished to go to Mandatory Palestine. U.S. President Harry Truman forwarded the Harrison report to the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee. Attlee firmly rejected both Truman's proposal and recommendations of the Harrison report. He also warned Truman of grievous harm to U.S.-British relations should the U.S. government publicly advocate for Jewish immigration. Mass protests in DP camps against British policy restricting immigration to Mandatory Palestine became common occurrences, but Britain continued their restrictive immigration policies. But as the refugee crisis escalated, the British government submitted the matter to the United Nations. In a special session, the UN General Assembly voted on November 29, 1947, to partition the territory of Mandatory Palestine into two new states, one Jewish and one Arab. Jewish leaders accepted, but the Arabs rejected. The British began to withdraw their forces in April 1948. Zionist leaders then prepared to formally establish a modern Jewish state. On May 18, 1948, David Ben-Gurion announced the formation of the State of Israel. President Truman recognized the new State of Israel the same day. All limitations on Jewish immigration to Israel were lifted. Holocaust survivors began arriving in the new state immediately. Many survivors fought and died as soldiers in Israel's War of Independence in 1948 to 1949. Although a minority of Israel's population, Holocaust survivors would go on to make significant contributions to the nation. For survivors and their families worldwide, the State of Israel remains an important source of security and pride. To punish the villains of the Holocaust, the Allies held the Nuremberg trials of 1945 to 46. There was a growing pressure on the Allied powers to create a homeland for Jewish survivors of the Holocaust, which would lead to the mandate for the creation of Israel in 1948.